Chapter 16, Bound for Oregon. I believe this is our last chapter, and then we have a little bit of information from the author's note that I would like to share with you. So in Chapter 15, they have finally reached the land of Oregon. This beautiful valley had opened up before them, and they realized many things that they were thankful for. Chapter 16. Father rented 40 acres of land. He mortgaged one pair of our oxen for seed grain and sold Bright for $30 to buy some of the supplies we needed. On the land was a one-room log cabin with a stone fireplace for cooking and a storeroom at the north end. We set up our tent nearby and went to work fixing it up. The first thing Father did was to make rockers for the padded box that first Cynthia and then Elijah had slept in during our journey. Now you have a real cradle, I told him, as Mother placed Elijah in it for the first time. He lay there looking up at us, kicking and cooing and smiling. He was such a happy baby. It seemed to me that his bright, dark eyes were staring straight into mine. He knows me, I thought. And I wondered if, young as he was, Elijah remembered that I was the one who carried him over those last rough, steep parts of the trail. I reached out my hand and gently rocked the cradle until his eyes fluttered closed. Next, Father built a table, some rough stools to sit on, and bedsteads for all of us. The beds were made from young trees trimmed down into poles and fastened to the walls. Our shelves underneath the frames he piled fragrant fir branches. On top of those went the feathered ticks we had carried all the way across the plains, and on top of the ticks our goose-down pillows and bright-colored quilts. It felt good finally to sleep in a real bed again. In the meantime, Mother and I were busy papering goods boxes to use as cupboards and dressers. One morning, I took every one of our cooking utensils and the big brass kettle down to a nearby spring. There, with ashes, sand, and soap, I did my best to scour all the signs of our long journey. The next day we unpacked everything from the wagon and set it in place. Our crude shelves built into the walls went into 2 remaining blue-white cups from our mother's china that Mother had refused to part with, the small, cracked-looking glass that Father used for shaving, our few books, Father's Bible, and a faded tin-type picture of Grandma with all of her living children. There, said Mother, looking pleased with her efforts. Now we are home. Seeing the picture reminded me that our folks back in Arkansas did not know we had arrived safely in Oregon. May I write a letter to Grandma? I asked. Of course, said Mother. She wrote a letter home and let me put mine with it. Dear Grandma, it is with pleasure that I take up my pen to write you a few lines. We are well and present. I have seen many curiosities since I saw you last. Part of the journey I liked very much, but some were tiresome. There was a great deal of sickness, and parts of the road were almost impossible to travel. I am sorry to tell you that Daisy was drowned in the Kaw River, and Lily died from eating a poison weed. We arrived on the 16th of October, making our journey 6 months long. I like Oregon very well, what I have seen of it, but it does not seem like home yet. I cannot be running over to Grandma's house like I used to. We have neighbors, but no meeting house and no schoolhouse. Father will teach us this winter. There is talk of building a schoolhouse in the spring. You should see Elijah. He is a good baby and hardly cries except when he is hungry. Louvenia and I have the thimbles you gave us, and we are sewing on our quilts. I now have 14 squares. We have your likeness, and it does us all a great deal of good to look at it. I have written everything I can think of, so I had better close. Give my love to Uncle Jimmy and Cousin Will and Great Aunt Harriet, and all the rest. Write soon. Yours affectionately, Mary Ellen Todd. As soon as I finished writing, I realized that I had said nothing about Grandma coming to be with us in Oregon. I knew the reason I hadn't. The feeling had been coming over me for a long time. The chances were that Grandma would not be able to make that long, hard journey. Once she could have. I could imagine her as a young woman striding over those plains and rivers and mountains as easily as if she were stepping on clouds. But she was old now, and not so strong. Probably, I thought, we would never see Grandma again. I felt a pang of loneliness then, so sharp that it was like a deep-down ache in my insides, an ache that might never go away. My eyes were stinging with tears as I folded the letter to give to Mother. As soon as the cabin was roughly finished, Father and John put in a crop. To tide us over until harvesting time, Father got some extra work splitting rails for fences, and John went to work on a neighboring farm, coming home only on Sundays. But even this might not be enough to get us through the winter, Father said. So Mother bought a spinning wheel. She and Lavinia and I spun wool into yarn, then knitted the yarn into socks, which Mother found she could sell at a very good price. Every evening, sitting around stone fireplace, Lavinia and I had to knit 1 inch. Father was not used to splitting rails, and one day he injured both his hands. Bruises turned into abscesses, and for several weeks he could not do any work. While we were sorry to see him suffer, I enjoyed having the chance to wait on him. Louvini and I fed him, tied his shoes, combed his hair for him, and turned the pages of his book. I don't know what I'd do without you children, he said. Why do you have to split rails? I asked him. Couldn't you make pottery instead like you used to? Father shook his head. I have no kiln, and even if I did, very few people settling hereabouts could afford to buy my wares. No, we have come to a place where the land is rich. We must put all of our strength into farming now. Father had been able to buy half a side of beef and a few vegetables, so we would not go hungry that winter. Still, I kept longing for more vegetables. John was always teasing me about my mountain fever appetite. One day, while poking through some dense high weeds, I discovered a little patch of forgotten potatoes on our neighbor's land. Can I dig them up? I asked Father. You will have to ask Mr. McCorkle, he replied. Perhaps he will let you do it on shares. So I mustered up my courage and went to talk to him. Mr. McCorkle looked at me, shrewd blue eyes peering out of his round, white-whiskered face. On shares, you say? Half for your family, half for me? I nodded. Suddenly thrust out his hand. All right, young lady, you have a deal. Louvini and I went to work. It was difficult hunting for the dried-up vines among all those tall weeds and digging the small potatoes out of the ground. Winter was fast approaching, and the cold made our fingers sting. Sometimes Lavinia cried and her hands ached so much. We took to making fires, working a while, then stopping to warm ourselves around the small blaze. We kept at it day after day until at last we had 6 sacks of potatoes for ourselves and 6 for Mr. McCorkle. When I brought them to show Mother, her face broke into one of her rare smiles. I am proud of you, Mary Ellen, she told me. You stuck to the task until it was done. Must have been that mountain appetite that made you dig so hard, Father added, laughing. You too shall have new books for this. And come spring, new dresses, promised Mother. I felt warm inside, almost as if I were standing close by the fire. Mother did care for me. I could feel it, even if she was never going to show it with hugs and kisses the way Grandma did. Then suddenly I realized something else. It had been weeks now since I had thought about my real mother. That picture of her that I carried around so long in my head seemed to have slipped away, and somehow, without even noticing it, Mother had taken her place. Time passed, and now it was truly winter. We rejoiced that we had our snug little cabin, enough food to eat, good warm fires, and books to read. Polly and Blackie and the other remaining cattle rested and fed in rich pastures, and Rover was his old self again, happily chasing squirrels. Sometimes on warm days, Louvini and I still played in our covered wagon, which now stood empty near the cabin. One day, sitting up on a spring seat, I picked up Father's whip again. Once more, I tried to crack it the way he did, and once more, I couldn't do it. Still, it seemed to me that it didn't quite feel so heavy. Every day after that, while Lavinia played her pretend games with our dolls inside the wagon, I practiced lifting that big whip, holding it over my head in an imaginary team of oxen, and flicking my wrist. And finally, one day, I heard the faint pop. You did it! Exclaimed Lavinia, poking her brown head out of the wagon. You made it crack! Yes, I said happily. A few days later, as I was approaching the cabin door carrying a water bucket, I overheard Father and Mother talking. Did you know, said Father, that Mary Ellen is beginning to be able to crack the whip? Pride welled up inside me and brimmed over a smile, but then I heard Mother's reply. I'm afraid it's not a very ladylike thing to do, she said. There it was again, that constant concern about me being a lady. Mother would always be pushing it at me, it seemed, and I would always be resisting. But in spite of her words, I walked around for the next few days filled with a secret joy. I had the power to set things going. It was December now, and the days were drawing near to Christmas. To get ready for our first celebration in our new home, Mother cleaned the cabin from top to bottom. Louvini and I went out into the woods and gathered ferns and vines and evergreen branches and arranged them in bunches. We decorated the walls and shelves and tables. Then we helped Mother make 6 real candles. She had borrowed the candle molds from Mrs. Daugherty, another of our neighbors. In the center of each mold, we carefully placed a cotton wick. After that, we poured in hot tallow and let it cool. When the tallow was set, we warmed the molds just a little, and out came 6 nice, straight, white candles. On Christmas morning, I was the first to wake up. For a moment, I just lay there beneath my 2 warm quilts, breathing in the sweet, piney smell of evergreens. Then, opening my eyes, I looked around at the looping chains of evergreens hanging from the shelves, the pickle jar filled with ferns on the table, and next to it the beautiful brass candlestick with its tall white candle waiting to be lighted. I nudged Lavinia, sleeping next to me. Christmas gift, I whispered in her ear. It was a game we played on our family every Christmas morning. The one who said it this greeting first scored a point. In a moment, Lavinia was jumping out of bed and whispered in Cynthia's ear, Christmas gift. And soon everyone was up and greeting each other and laughing, Christmas gift, Christmas gift. We did not expect real gifts this year, but Mother surprised Lavinia and me with mittens that she had knitted for us late in the evenings after we were sleeping. And Father had carved a doll with a wooden head, and Mother had dressed it in scraps of red-white fabric for Cynthia. So now she had a doll like ours. And for baby Elijah, there was a string of buttons to play with. I yike her, Cynthia kept squealing with excitement, her pudgy fingers holding her new doll tight. At noon, we sat down to our Christmas dinner. The table was covered with tasty dishes, roast beef and gravy, mashed potatoes, cabbage slaw, cornbread baked in our Dutch oven, and the sweet butter to go with it. Mother had also made some pumpkin butter, which added a spicy flavor. And with all this and Mother's sweet cake and some stick candy that John had brought us, we were as full as we could be. After dinner, we sang hymns and carols for a while. Then Father brought out his chessboard, and he and John settled in for a game, while Mother and I tried to teach Lavinia to play checkers. Later, the three of us children went outside to play hide and seek, and Annie over, and Pussy wants a corner. We played until Cynthia stubbed her toe and started to cry, and then we all went back inside. Finally, the evening chores were done. The cows had been milked and all the animals fed. It was time to light our Christmas candles. One by one, Father put a match to them, and the cabin was filled with warm, flickering glow. Ooh, breathed Cynthia, her eyes wide. We gathered around the stone fireplace, Father, Mother, and the two splint-bottom easy chairs. The rest of us on the floor. Father cracked hazelnuts while Mother set some corn to popping in the Dutch oven. Looking into the flames, seeing the old, familiar chairs drawn up by the fire, smelling the warm smell of popcorn, I thought that our cabin was beginning to feel like a home. Remember the time we tried to pop corn out in the rain near the Kaw River, John asked. It was all hard and tasted like smoke, I recalled, but we thought it was good. Then I remembered something else. How about our 2-year-old yearling that was drowning in the crossing? John's face flushed pink, but then he retorted by saying, either into my jaw and sit down on my throat. And I had to laugh. After a few minutes, Mother settled back in her easy chair. Her face seemed to have filled out and become softer in the last few weeks. I wonder what it is like now out on the plains, she said. In many places the snow could be several feet deep and the temperature well below zero, Father answered. I wouldn't want to be stranded out there in the middle of winter. I thought about the constant wind out in the plains, how fierce and icy it would be now. I thought about blowing snow and howling wolves, and despite of the cheerful warmth of our fire, I felt myself shiver. I hope all the wagon trains got through all right, I said. Mother seemed far away, thinking of something. I keep wondering about the Grants, she said softly. We talked about the Grants, and brave Mrs. McReynolds and her brood of children, the Tedroses, and Sarah Jane's family. I thought of the mule train with the words sure and swift painted on its wagon cover that had been passing us, and the frightened family that had turned back because of cholera on the Platte River. What were they all doing now? That reminded me again of Grandma and our other relatives back in Arkansas. Do you think they have our letters now? And know we are safe? I hope so, answered Mother, and soon we will have a letter from them. I would keep on writing to Grandma. I would tell her all about our first Christmas and how Elijah could roll over now and might be getting his first tooth. I would tell her about the books that Father had borrowed from Mr. McCorkle and the latest plans for building a schoolhouse. Even if she could not come to live with us in Oregon, we could stay close to each other by letter. Then all at once, I had a wonderful idea. So here you see the family enjoying their first Christmas in Oregon. I would take my 9-patch squares that Grandma had started me on, and I would sew them into a quilt for Elijah. I had enough almost for a baby quilt. It would be a special gift to him from me, but it would also be a gift from Grandma, another way of remembering her. I couldn't help smiling at the thought. Then Father took down his Bible from the shelf, and we all drew close together while he read the story from the first Christmas. Then the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in the swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. I looked at our baby Elijah, sleeping peacefully now in his cradle next to the fireplace. Cynthia had fallen asleep too in Mother's arms, still clutching her new doll close to her. Lavinia was beginning to yawn. It was time for bed. Sleepily, Lavinia and I crawled under our quilts. Mother tucked them snugly around us. "Good night," came her quiet voice. I felt something touch my hair, as light, soft as a whisper, or maybe an angel's wing. Was it Mother's hand? It was gone so quickly that I could not be sure. Then Father blew out the candles, and everything was still. So that's the end of Bound for Oregon. However, there is a very special section here called the author's note that the author has left the story. So I'd like to read that to you now. Most of the story is true. There really was a Mary Ellen Todd who traveled with her family on the Oregon Trail when she was 9 years old. After Mary Ellen grew up, she liked to tell stories about this memorable journey, first to her daughter, Adrietta, and later to her grandchildren. When Adrietta Applegate Hickston was an old woman, she wrote down her mother's stories, and finally, after her death, they were published in a little book called On to Oregon, a true story of a young girl's journey into the West. It was on this book that my story is based. I stumbled upon Mary Ellen Todd's account while doing research about the Oregon Trail. Thousands of travelers moved along this trail during the years of westward migration from 1840 to 1870, and many of them wrote about their experiences in diaries and letters to relatives back home. However, nearly all of these were adults. It was difficult to learn what the journey had been like for children. A few reminiscences existed, memories written down years later by men and women who had made the trip as children, but in most cases, their recollections were sketchy. On to Oregon was different. It was filled with descriptions and vivid details. The language and writing style would probably seem old-fashioned to modern readers, but reading it, I immediately felt as if I'd been along on the journey with this young girl and her family. I wanted others to share that journey, so I decided to retell Mary Ellen's story. In the retelling, I have not changed any of the major events of the story. The Todd family had to deal with most of the problems commonly faced along the trail. Disagreements among members of the wagon train, dangerous river crossings, illnesses, injuries, shortages of food and water, loss of livestock. They also had difficulties worse than many. Traveling in 1852, one of the worst years of the cholera epidemic, they nearly lost a daughter to this terrible disease. They experienced an attack by hostile Indians, something that travelers commonly feared, but which rarely actually happened. Through all of their troubles, Mary Ellen's family reacted with a mixture of common sense, courage, and religious faith that was typical of these westward moving pioneers. Much was left out of Mary Ellen's recollections, and this I have had to imagine. Names of relatives and families were invented, as were some of Mary Ellen's feelings, in particular about her grandmother and her biological mother. The Todds' home in Arkansas and their final destination in Oregon have been imagined with the help of historical research. Details of places along the trail have been reconstructed from the first-hand observations of other travelers of the period. As I recorded in dozens of their diaries, in addition, I have walked along the Barlow Road under the shadow of the towering Mount Hood and gazed up at that steep cliff called Laurel Hill. I managed to locate the place near Salem that was once called Howell's Prairie, where the Todds first settled. There is still a Howell's Prairie Road, and the area remains a beautiful farming valley. An interesting sidelight of the westward migration was that it took place less than a decade before the Civil War, during a time of increasing national conflict over the issue of slavery. Some who moved west did so to escape the practice. The Todd family was concerned about this issue, as demonstrated by discussions among the men at one point along the way. Abbott L. Todd, Mary Ellen's father, was the first cousin of Mary Todd, the wife of Abraham Lincoln. A deeply religious man, he was firmly against slavery, but some took the other side. In the book, I have reproduced the argument as Mary Ellen recollected it. Though the language is offensive, this is the way the debate sounded at the time. A few words about the Todd family after the Christmas of 1852, when my story ends. Sometime the following spring, Mary Ellen's father came across a newspaper account of a wagon train that had been stranded all winter near Fort Boise. The people were starving and many had died. Those who survived were forced to slaughter their mules for food, and even to gnaw on the harnesses. On the wagon covers, the rescuers said, could still be seen the painted words, "Sure and Swift." This was that fast-moving, elegant mule train that Mary Ellen had so envied. According to Mary Ellen's account, her father later became an ordained minister, as did Joel Powell, the captain of the large wagon train that had rescued the Todds and Grants from the Indians. The two men met often at the religious meetings and became close friends. Mary Ellen grew up in Oregon and married John Applegate, a cattle rancher. Eventually, she and her family moved to southwestern Idaho near the city of Weiser, only a few miles from the Snake River, and the trails she had traveled years before. Mary Ellen Todd died in 1924 at the age of 81. So, I hope you enjoyed our story. Join me again for something new. Keep following.